All right, now we're going to take a look at solving two-step equations. Do a little vocabulary review so that when I identify different parts of the equation, you know what I'm talking about. So we have our equation 5 plus 2x equals 15. These two numbers that have no variable being multiplied are both called constants. Remember, the constant is a number that's never going to change. No matter what the value of x ends up being, 5 will always stay 5 and 15 will always stay 15. That 2x term is going to change depending on what x equals. But the 5 and the 15 will always stay 5 and 15. That's why they're called constants. The constant that's being added to the variable, that's the constant we end up getting rid of in our equation. So then we have this term right here that has the variable involved. X is our variable. 2 is the coefficient. Two is not the the x is not the coefficient. X is the variable. The 2 is the coefficient. So things we want to remember, the side of the equation that has the variable, so this side that has the variable here, we get rid of the constant and we get rid of the coefficient. Getting rid of the constant and the coefficient will get us our variable all by itself. So with our two steps, so we have two numbers to eliminate. We have the constant to eliminate and the coefficient to eliminate. So let's run through our steps again and see how the steps that we've been going through, how they apply to a two-step equation. So our first step is to simplify each side. Okay, that's our additive inverse. That's where we change subtraction to addition. Add the opposite is another way we've looked at this. So you may want to add a little note to the additive inverse. And then any other simplifying that you'll have to do. Eventually there will be some simplifying other than, adding the opposite. But this would be the point where any other simplifying that had to get done, if there happened to be some combining like terms or distributing or any other little manipulation that we can do that we can consider simplifying. Step 2, still remembering our goal. Isolate the variable. Get the variable by itself on one side. Okay, knowing your goal makes it a lot easier to figure out how I'm going to get there. If I know my destination, then I can plan my route. Okay, that's all we're doing here. Step 3. So the first thing we want to undo in our equation, up until this point, you didn't really have more than one option. You either had an equation where we were adding a constant to the variable, or you had an equation where we were multiplying or had a coefficient with the variable. It was like one or the other. Do I undo addition or do I undo multiplication? Well, now with the two steps, we have to do both. And remember, when we're solving an equation, it's like unwrapping a present. So we're reversing the order of operations. So the addition is what happens last in the order of operations, but it's actually what we undo first in an equation. A couple things to remember. The terms being added must become 0. Okay, so the number being added to the variable must become 0. That's the goal. Because 0 plus any number is itself, right? because a plus 0 equals a, right? Any number plus 0 is itself. To make that number become 0, you add the opposite of that number to both sides. So add its opposite to both sides. Step 4, undo the multiplication. So when we're undoing our multiplication, the things we need to remember is that the coefficient must become 1. Okay, if we're looking at numbers being multiplied by the x, that's the coefficient. 1 times x equals x. Now, in order to make that coefficient become 1, we do that by multiplying the reciprocal on both sides. And finally, and it's even more important now that we've got these two-step equations to check your answer. That's something for your own knowledge of whether you got this correct or not is something you should really do. All right, so let's take a look at our first example. This is the equation that we just saw a few minutes ago. Now remember, go through our steps. Step 1, simplify anything that needs to get simplified. I don't have subtraction to deal with. There's nothing else going on in this equation. I have a nice addition, multiplication kind of equation happening here. So step 2 is remembering what our goal is. Our goal is to have x by itself. Then I know x equals some number. So I have two numbers in the way of being able to find x. I have this coefficient that's being multiplied, and I have this 5 that's being added. Those are the two numbers that need to go bye-bye. Undoing addition is the easiest thing to do first. There is a way to undo that multiplication, but nobody on the planet wants to do that right now. It will overcomplicate the entire situation. So undoing the addition is the easiest, most efficient way to start solving this equation. Okay, so we want to handle that first. So this 5 right here is what we're going to get rid of first. Now remember, if you're unsure what to do first, if you're saying to yourself, well, I don't know. Okay, I know I have to handle the addition first, but what do I do? Do I multiply? Do I subtract? What do I do? Just think for a second. This 5 right here needs to disappear. There are two options. My number is either going to become a 0 or become a 1, right? Those are the two options that we have for these numbers that we're getting rid of. Think about it. Here are my two options. I have 0 plus 2x or 1 plus 2x. Which of these two options here, option 1 or option 2, which of these two options is going to get me closer to having x by itself? This one is. This does not get me any closer to having x by itself. Now I have a 1 added instead of the 5. This option right here doesn't get me anywhere. So if you stop and think about it for a minute, you should be able to figure out what you have to do to achieve our first step of the goal. Okay, our first step of our goal is going to get rid of that 5 and have my equation be 2x equals something, right? Okay, so now that we've thought that through, this 5 needs to become 0. A negative 5 will take care of that for me. Add the opposite of that number to both sides. The opposite of 5 is negative 5. Now you can look at that as subtract 5. That's fine. The only thing is once we start getting negatives, a bunch of different negatives involved, you could start confusing yourself at one point or another. So you'll hear me talking about this as a negative 5. So double check your math. 5 minus 5 does equal 0. 5 plus negative 5 does equal 0. If I have positive 15 and negative 5, I end up with 10. Remember, different signs, find the difference. The difference between 15 and 5 is 10. I have more positives, so my answer is positive. So now this actually looks like the multiplication equations you've been doing over and over and over again. So once we get this first step handled, this really should be review. So I have 2 being multiplied by x. I need to eliminate this 2. I need this 2 to become a 1. The only way to make that become a 1 is, well, not the only way, but the most efficient way is going to be to make this a fraction, make my coefficient a fraction, and then multiply each side by the reciprocal. Make sure when you're copying these examples, you're being very clear. You're giving yourself a lot of space. I'm seeing a lot of people smushing everything together, and then they can't read what they're writing. They're losing X's, they're losing negative signs. Do not smush and smash. Give yourself room. So my 2's cancel. And my X is the only thing left. On the right-hand side, remember to multiply across when we're multiplying fractions. You could multiply across and get 10 over 2 and then simplify and get 5. Or we can simplify diagonally. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And then I end up with 5 over 1, which is just 5. To check this, I'm going to substitute a 5 in for my x. So 5 plus 2 times 5, does it equal 15? Do my multiplication first. I get 5 plus 10. 5 plus 10 does equal 15. Example number 2. Again, let's go through our steps. Step 1 is to simplify. Is there any subtraction to deal with? Nothing crazy going on. So step 2 is to remember our goal. Our main goal is to find out what x equals. I've got 2 numbers standing in my way. I have this number 2 that's being added. And if I force a fraction here, I actually have 1/3 as my coefficient. These 2 numbers are going to get eliminated. Okay. We want to undo our addition first, so I'm going to focus here. Don't worry about everything else going on. Just know that you have a positive 2 that has to become 0. Because eventually on this side here, I want 0 plus x over 3. Because 0 plus x over 3 is just x over 3. And that gets me closer to my final goal. To make that to a 0, I use the opposite. A number plus its opposite equals 0. Let's do that on both sides. 2 plus negative 2 cancels to 0. I get x over 3 equals. Now here's where you can get yourself into trouble if you're thinking of this as minus 2. If you tell yourself negative 6 minus 2, think about that for a second. If I have 6 negatives, can I take away 2 positives? I don't have any positives to give. It's like me owing you $6, so I'm broke, and then you come up to me and say, let me borrow $2. How am I going to give you $2? I have nothing. I actually owe you money. How am I going to give you $2? Right? I cannot take away positives if all I have are negatives. So, don't think of this as subtraction. Think of it as a negative 2. If I have 6 negatives, 3, 4, 5, 6, I have 6 negatives, and I have 2 more negatives. Guess how many negatives I have total? I have 8. Remember, if you have the same sign, you combine. I combine my 6 and my 2 to get 8. Because I'm combining negatives, my answer is a negative. Now, if we look at our fraction here, the number that I need to get rid of is 1/3. Remember, every variable has a 1 in front if you can't see a number already. And we need to figure out what to multiply on both sides, right? So if my coefficient is 1/3, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. And I'm going to do that on both sides. My 3's and 1's cancel and leave me with x. On the right-hand side, I just multiply across, and I get negative 24. To check this, I'm just going to substitute and see if this equals negative 6. Do my division first. I get 2 plus negative 8. A negative divided by a positive is negative. 24 divided by 3 is 8. 2 plus negative 8 is negative 6. Remember, I have different signs, so I find the difference. The difference between 2 and 8 is 6. I have more negatives, so my answer is negative. Next example. First thing I see is subtraction we have to deal with. So I get 10 plus negative 4x. Remember, subtraction becomes addition, and this number right here becomes the opposite. Just because there's an x doesn't mean anything changes. Instead of 4x, it becomes negative 4x. So now, remember our goal. X equals something. So I've got to get rid of my 10 and my negative 4. We undo our addition first. So this guy is going to become 0 by adding negative 10 to both sides. 10 plus negative 10 is 0. I'm left with negative 4x. Be careful again over here. The answer is not 0. If I have 10 negatives and I combine it with 10 more negatives, I have 20 negatives. Same sign, combine. I combine them and get 20. Because they're both negative, it's negative 20. So now again, this should be review. We've got our multiplication equation here. Let me make that coefficient into a fraction so that I can multiply by the reciprocal. Again, this is where you want to make sure that you're writing nice and big, nice and clear. So I'm seeing people lose negative signs all over the place, confusing themselves. My 4's and my 1's cancel. Negative times a negative leaves me with positive x. Now over here, you can multiply across. Remember, if I have positives and negatives, let's handle those first. A negative times a negative is a positive. So I know my answer will be positive. Now I can ignore the negative signs. I can cross simplify by dividing. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 20 divided by 4 is 5. My answer is positive 5. Or I could have multiplied across and got 20 over 4, which still would give me 5. Either method is fine. Then if you would like to check it, pause and do a quick check. Example number 4. Now we have our x on the other side, but nothing is changing. We're still going to go through our steps. I don't have any simplifying to do. I have no subtraction. Got nothing crazy going on. So now we're going to just remember what our goal is. X by itself. Now my x is on the right-hand side, so I'm just going to bring it down. Now remember, I have a 3 that's being added, a 5 that's my coefficient. Those two numbers need to go away. Okay, we're going to get rid of that 3 first because undoing addition is much easier. So I'm going to add negative 3 to both sides. Remember, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. If you are not writing the same exact number on both sides here, you're doing something wrong. If these two numbers, do not add up to 0, you're doing something wrong. -7 and -3 is -10. Same sign, combine. I'm adding negatives, so my answer is negative. -10 equals 5x. My 3's cancel. Give me 0. So now, this should look very familiar. I want to get rid of my 5 next. So I'm going to make it into a fraction so that I can multiply each side by the reciprocal. My 5's cancel. Double check this as well. I have people crossing stuff out that should not be crossed out. Truly look at that and tell yourself, are these numbers canceling? And my 1's cancel. So I'm left with my x. On the left-hand side, you can multiply across. 10 times 1 is 10. 5 times 1 is 5. A positive times a negative is negative. Divide each of these by 5, and you're left with -2. Or we can simplify across. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 10 divided by 5 is 2. Positive times a negative is negative. Multiplying across gives me -2 as my answer. Another example here. First thing to do is rewrite this using our adding the opposite. Here's the other thing. If you look at this for a second, I'm going to give you a side note. Sometimes you're going to see, up to this point, you saw in the equations that look like this, where the fraction was off to the side of the x. But in this example, the 4 and the x are actually on the numerator together. There is no difference between these two write-ups. Sometimes you'll see this handwritten way. Sometimes you'll see how the example is. So I wanted to make sure I showed you that. It's still talking about the same thing. The coefficient is still 4/5. Okay, and we'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to address it from the get-go. So subtraction becomes addition. 9 becomes negative. Okay, remember, our goal is to get x equals a number. I have my number that's added and my coefficient that's being multiplied. Undo the addition first. Add 9 to both sides. I get 4/5 x. My 9's cancel. -17, +9. Different signs, find the difference. The difference between 17 and 9, if you just do some old school subtraction, you get 8. Do I have more negatives or more positives? I have more negatives, so my answer's -8. So now I have this coefficient, and again, even if it's written together like this, 4/5 is still the coefficient, which means I need to multiply each side by the reciprocal. My 4's and 5's cancel. Over on the right, I can simplify diagonally. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 8 divided by 4 is 2. Multiply across. 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 1 is 1. Don't forget about your negative. I have a negative number times a positive number, which gives me -10. Now, see, even I'm a little smashed here. I don't want anybody getting confused, so x equals -10. And we're going to take a second and do a little guided practice. So you're going to copy the problem down, push pause. I want you to solve it on your own. Then I'll put the work and the answer up so you can check yourself. If you're struggling, just look back at the examples. So go back to example 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. See if you can find one that looks similar and walk yourself through the steps. Try these on your own. Here's our first guided practice. So copy that down and hit pause. And then we'll go through the answer. Okay, you should have gotten x equals 10. If you got x equals 10, that's awesome. Take a minute and go through the steps and see if you did everything correctly. Now, you may have done something a teeny tiny bit different. Maybe your process is a little bit different than mine, but you still completed it using algebra. And what I mean is, maybe you decided to divide each side by 2 or something like that. Definitely adding the opposite needed to happen from the get-go. Okay, remember this number has to become 0. If I can make negative 16 0, I know I'm closer to figuring out x. My 16s cancel. 4 plus 16 is 20. Okay, then we have our coefficient of 2 here that has to become a 1. To do that, we multiply by the reciprocal, right? On both sides. Multiplying by the reciprocal cancels my 2's out, and I'm left with 1x, right? Let's look at another one. This is a perfect time. If you struggled with this, hit pause and get some help. Here's guided practice number 2. Right. Let's take a look at your answer. You should have gotten negative 50. So take a second and look through the work. Even if you got it correct, just double check that you did everything right and you didn't skip any steps, no shortcuts. Okay, we need this 9 to become 0. 9 plus negative 9 is 0. Add negative 9 to both sides. So you end up with x over 5 equals negative 10. Okay, if to get our coefficient to use, I put my 1 in front of x, which gives me 1/5. The reciprocal is 5 over 1. Multiply that on each side. X equals negative 50. Last problem. Try this guy. Hit pause. And hopefully you got negative 6 as your answer. Take a second, look through the work. Remember, we undo addition first. So this piece right here is going to become 0. Negative 10 plus 6 is where we got negative 4 here. Remember, our coefficient is 2/3. To eliminate that, we need to multiply by the reciprocal on each side, right? Simplify. You'll see the simplifying steps in orange, and you end up with negative 6. Now remember, if this simplifying is tricky for you, then just multiply across. You get 12 over 2. Negative times a positive makes negative. Then you simplify. And you get negative 6. And that's it.